So, around the turn of the 20th century, not everyone welcomed the Beaux-Arts projects of America and the White City in 1893, as you can imagine. But the influence of John Ruskin extended far beyond the mid-19th century Gothic revival. If you'll remember, he condemned the moral decline of industrial society, which denied the satisfaction of craft to the worker, and reviled the classical orders as overrated and standardized, antithetical to human expression and individuality. Ruskin's descriptions of the skill and toil of medieval cathedral builders, selflessly carving stone and tooling wood, inspired several generations toward the return to handicrafts and architecture. Ruskin advocated for a moralistic, crafts-based society centered around communal cooperation of the medieval period, as opposed to factory competition of the modern era. Preferably, he advocated for communities centered around the church. William Morris was one of Ruskin's greatest converts, and he secularized Ruskin's ideas in the late 1800s. He proposed an artistic and political program that exalted the dignity of the craftsperson while advocating for sort of community-based forms of socialism. William Morris was essentially an apostle to Ruskin, and Ruskin's writings were hostile to the division of labor, to factory production, to commercialism, and to slick warehouse wares that were really poorly made but had a shiny gloss to make them look good. In order for those goods to be manufactured, factory workers were in a sense enslaved. They were de-skilled, turned into little more than machines or machine operators. In Ruskin's idealistic view, one person should be able to design an object and also make that object. The whole process of design and production should be in the hands of one person, ideally. Morris is really the generation after Ruskin, and he had the pragmatic business sense of establishing a successful, profitable furniture and architecture company to promote the realistic and individual lifestyle from Ruskin's ideas. So William Morris essentially ushered in the idea behind the arts and crafts movement in England. He was primarily a British textile and wallpaper designer, but also a major social activist bent towards reforming the ills of industrial society, primarily through communal living and producing art. His writings helped win acceptance of an early socialist party, the Socialist League in Britain. Like Henry Hobson Richardson, he came under the strong influence of medievalism while studying at Oxford, and he developed close friendships with neo-Gothic architects. Morris's medievalism was all tied to his interest in medieval history and architecture, but also to Britain's growing medievalist movement, a form of old world romanticism that rejected the many values of Victorian industrial capitalism. For Morris, the Middle Ages represented an era with these strong chivalric values and an organic, pre-capitalist sense of community, both of which he deemed preferable to his own period. Morris sort of adopted Ruskin's philosophy of rejecting the industrial manufacture of decorative arts and architecture in favor of a return to hand craftsmanship, both in architecture and interior design. He advocated for raising artisans to the status of artists and creating art that should be affordable and handmade with no hierarchy of artistic mediums. So gone were the days where just sculptors, architects, and painters were the only ones who could be called artists. The entirety of a building should conform to one vision, down to handcrafted lampshades and seats, created by artists and artisans in cooperation. So Morris founded an interior decorative arts firm called Morris & Co. that produced medieval handicraft, tapestries, wallpaper, fabrics, furniture, and stained glass windows as a sort of counterculture to the mass-produced consumerism products that had struck furniture and decor in the Western world. He devoted his final years to publishing illuminated-style print books, arguing for a break from the machine-produced look. With the industrial era in the West and East, much of the working class had hit rock bottom, being totally dependent on employers for their wages in a world that hadn't yet developed much advocacy for living wages or welfare. The arts and crafts movement took shape during this turbulent atmosphere. The arts and crafts movement reached maturity in England during the last 2 decades of the 19th century. Here, architects attempted to free themselves from the historic high styles by emulating lower, vernacular, ordinary buildings. Planners promoted garden cities as an alternative to the sprawling urban metropolis. Eventually, the arts and crafts movement spread to Europe and the US, Australia, and India. Though the movement never properly reformed society into these craft-based socialist communities that Ruskin dreamed about. So, through the example of John Ruskin, a grassroots effort attempted to circumvent industrialism and return to handicrafts. So let's go back to the 1850s when William Morris got this movement off the ground. So when Morris moved to London in 1856, he was fascinated by the city, but very dismayed by its population and rapid expansion into the neighboring countryside, describing it as the spreading sore. Morris designed Red House in Kent with the architect Philip Webb, with finances from his wealthy family, where he could live communally with his young friends, resulting in a house that served as the first integrated manifesto to the arts and crafts aesthetic. Red House appeared sort of English rustic without making specific historical references, and this later became a defining feature of the arts and crafts movement houses wherever they would be built. This specifically is sometimes called English freestyle because it kind of recalls English vernacular sympathies without making specific references to specific styles. It's kind of an English cottage house, a blend between a medieval, Tudor, and Victorian house. It was built in modest red brick with high-pitched red tile roofs and a stair tower. The windows were deliberately all made in different shapes and sizes, some rounded, some pointed, by placing them randomly instead of following a geometric order, to kind of break from the standard grids of architecture at the time. And then on the inside, Morris designed and commissioned furniture for the flat in a sort of medieval English style, much of which he painted with Arthurian scenes in a direct rejection of mainstream artistic tastes. Morris' experience of crafting the interior and furnishings with his wife and friends motivated him to set up a business in handicraft goods in London, starting his workshop of Morris & Co. So Red House sort of launched his friend Philip Webb's career and inspired many further architects because it campaigned as a synthesis of the arts and of social reform. Philip Webb's early work resembled the Queen Anne vernacular with a sort of penchant for half timbering and bay windows. It was kind of this improvised idea of an English medieval vernacular cottage looking style. One of the other fellows from the Red House, William Letheby, built this church as a memorial church for his recently deceased mother and father. Outside, it was a standing rubble church that resembled some of the earliest churches in Anglo-Saxon England, built during the 600s, with its central tower, simple cruciform plan, bell tower, small windows, and a thatch roof. But it refuses to conform to the Romanesque in its use of square latticed windows. Its pointed vault ceiling on the inside conveyed the essential qualities of a medieval church, but without referencing to a recognizable historical style, a very arts and crafts thing to do. The arts and crafts architects essentially wanted to capture the spirit of English vernacular architecture without having to strictly adhere to historical forms. A new style for a new arts and crafts age, freed from the bonds of the past, but one synonymous with the past of common man. Edwin Lutyens was the most successful architect to emerge from the architects experimenting with the English freestyle of the arts and crafts. His early houses derived from this broad vernacular type, as with the rest. The best example is this house he designed for his best friend, Gertrude Jekyll, south of London. And he created a series of more country houses for friends around London, influencing the style of English estates after this point. The Scottish architect Charles René Mackintosh also came from the arts and crafts movement. He worked in and around Glasgow in eclectic styles, but soon preferred the Scottish freestyle he would create. Mackintosh's first major project was the Mackintosh Architecture Building at the Glasgow School of Art, began in 1897, which became one of the city's defining landmarks. This was one of Mackintosh's first commissions. At only 29, he was working for the Scottish architectural firm Honeyman and Keppie when he became largely responsible for the design of the building because the school's director advocated for the arts and crafts approach, like the English freestyle houses down south. The client desired a utilitarian atmosphere free of direct historical references, with well-lit studios to accommodate wood carving and stained glass production. Mackintosh wanted an industrial exterior to fit well with Glasgow's industrial aesthetic, but an interior with strong hints of arts and crafts handicraft to inspire the students. Agreeing, Mackintosh set out to create a Scottish version of the English freestyle, so he used a mixture of subtle Scottish influences that were to define the architect's later career. These can be detected in the building's form and detailing, ranging from Scottish baronial estates and Scottish late medieval castles, and even to traditional Japanese timberwork. Like Scottish baronial estates, small functionless turrets extend beyond the roofline. Like 16th century Scottish castles, the facade is largely flat but broken up by cleverly placed and interesting windows with gridded frames to make one wonder what lies behind. It's built in the sandstone bricks familiar to Scottish baronial estates, with dramatic bay windows projecting from the walls. The West Wing houses the school's most famous room, the Mackintosh Library, a double-height nave which was constructed around a complex framework of timber posts and beams, influenced by traditional Japanese architecture. Mackintosh designed Hill House in Helensburgh, northwest of Glasgow, for the famous publisher Walter Blackie. Mackintosh wrote that he wanted to design an abstract building that did not resemble an English mansion, Italian villa, Swiss chalet, or even a Scottish castle, but merely a dwelling house, true to its form in the Scottish freestyle, not trying to be anything else. The result was a house very lightly resembling a Scottish baronial estate, stripped down of every frill and ornament and covered in rough plaster, a staggered mass of traditional baronial 19th century Scottish architectural elements like round towers, steep roofs, flat facades broken up by square windows, and a liberal amount of rectangular chimneys. True to arts and crafts, reminiscent of Morris's Red House, it had 40 different window shapes placed asymmetrically. During the 1880s, the arts and crafts movement became much more socialist in some circles. In the 1880s, Morris began to campaign directly for Marxist socialism, but soon adhered to a more reformist theory aimed at restructuring cities. He preached that beauty was a right regardless of class, yet his handcrafted book, wallpapers, and furniture could only be afforded by elite clients, but this unavoidable dilemma bothered him. In his novel, News from Nowhere, written in 1890, he described an alternative to the metropolis. He says, "Suppose people lived in little communities among gardens and fields so that you could be in the country in 5 minutes' walk, had few wants, and studied the arts of enjoying life. Then, I think, one might hope civilization had really begun." Such a vision corresponded to the Garden City proposed by social reformer Ebenezer Howard, who moved in the same small socialist circles as Morris and knew him personally. Howard proposed a garden city in his book Tomorrow, A Peaceful Path to Real Reform, written in 1898. As a means of controlling urban growth and maintaining human dignity, he advocated for a self-sufficient network of small cities separated by forests and agriculture. Howard saw firsthand the terrible living conditions prevailing in the cities of England. In his book, he wrote, "Town and country must be married. Out of this joyous union will spring new hope, new life, and new civilization." Howard proposed garden cities will feature the best aspects of town and country, with all the opportunities but none of the problems that each afforded. Each city should be split into zones with proportions set out for industry, green space, housing, and commerce. The element of the vision would be this: the profits from rents would be reinvested in the town for the benefit of the people. In 1899, Howard formed the Garden City Association to help gain support for his idea. The writings of Morris and Howard inspired the creation of the Garden City Society, a large socialist group in England whose ideas molded young architects to create the beginnings of garden cities and experimental company towns. The Lever Soap Company's Port Sunlight was built in the 1890s by architects associated with Howard. Arts and crafts cottages are surrounded by paths winding through the fields, and woodland architects Grayson and Old designed 800 units of worker housing in the craftsman style, providing residents with an array of public buildings, among them an art gallery, hospital, schools, a concert hall, a swimming pool, a church, and a hotel. The young arts and crafts architect Raymond Unwin and Barry Parker, also part of the official Garden City Society, won a competition to design the town of Letchworth, a new town to be built in the farmland of Hertfordshire, to be the first official garden city based entirely on Howard's theory, sponsored by the Garden City Pioneer Company. It was in actuality a plot fit for a small town. Their master plan for the new garden town in 1903 was relatively denser than what Howard would have had, but with its radiating streets around a central core of public buildings, his theory remained genuine. It featured several of the key ideas that Howard expressed in his book. It had zoning of different areas for different uses, Workers' houses were situated away from the smoke and steam of the factories, but close enough to walk or bike to them at the town center, and green spaces incorporated throughout for parklands and agricultural lands. Unwin and Parker designed many of the town's structures in the English freestyle. It was in its day a unique town and a creative solution to the squalor and poverty of urban life in 19th century Britain. So it became an example to architects and planners for new towns all over England and eventually post-World War II towns in Britain and the US. The English arts and crafts movement soon had a strong appeal to German designers. The English enthusiasm for the arts and crafts inspired the foundation of the German Werkbund, which attracted a similar roster of utopians, idealists, and socialists. The Werkbund was founded in Munich in 1907 in condemnation of eclectic and historic taste in design and furniture and architecture, but the Germans didn't reject industrialism and commerce like the English arts and crafts guilds, they merely wished to reform them. Unlike small English arts and crafts guilds, the Werkbund evolved into a significant national organization with more than 1,500 members. Its debates ranged from love of regional vernaculars to promoters of arts for art's sake. Many Werkbund members were simply defenders of German regional styles. Many members of Werkbund traveled through English arts and crafts garden cities, absorbing ideas in the 1890s. Richard Rimmerschmid, one of the founders of the Werkbund, designed Carl Schmitt's company town at the first garden city outside England. It featured a factory, marketplace, duplex houses, gently curving streets, and a school of dance and music. He insisted that the public buildings at the center of the town, unlike the arts and crafts housing units around them, follow a clear hierarchy of classicism, but in a more simplified style. A stripped-down temple front became the focus of the community as the town meeting hall. Margrethe Krupp designed the other significant garden city in Germany in 1910, about 1 kilometer from her steel factories. Over 3,000 duplex dwellings lined narrow lands. The gables and dormers of the roofs came from Germanic folk housing. While she pursued a variety of vernacular styles, she gave the town unity by coating the buildings in gray rough-cut plaster, a trick borrowed from the English freestyle. White columns on the porches and green window trim and shutters gave the town a sense of identity. A 200-meter deep wood engulfed the entire settlement, reinforcing a separate identity from the surrounding districts and towns. The works of Ruskin and Morris also deeply affected the development of architectural language in the United States. Gustav Stickley, in emulation of Morris, established a furniture company in Syracuse, New York, where he produced his mission-style tables and chairs, a new indigenous, no-nonsense freestyle furniture for a new America, honest and anti-factory in its handmade craft production and unobscured by Baroque or Gothic frills. This new furniture was plain, simple, honest, and forthright. It really expressed the ideal views of Ruskin and Morris in wood. You could see the simple peg and slot joinery in it. You could see how it was built and easily understand it. It combined geometric beauty with functionality. It was comfortable and straightforward, unlike much of the showy Baroque furniture of the day. Gustav was showing people that you could transform the quality of your life from the inside of your home out by how you choose to live. Simplistic furniture for an unobstructed mind. Stickley began publishing the Craftsman magazine in 1901 and spread ideas and styles of the arts and crafts monthly across America. The first issue was dedicated to William Morris. Aside from advertising his own wooden furniture, Stickley ran articles on Native American crafts, Japanese joinery, socialism, contemporary architecture, home design, and garden cities. He essentially created a gospel for the cult of artists, patrons, and admirers of the arts and crafts movement. The magazine largely rejected traditional values. It was concerned about ecology, children and women's rights in the workplace, and above all, experimenting with how to express a back-to-nature lifestyle that the arts and crafts movement was in favor of. Stickley even attempted to manufacture prototype houses for his own building company. The Craftsman magazine published house designs by well-known artists building in the arts and crafts style. As a result of Stickley's colonial revival-style family house being badly damaged by a fire in 1901, Stickley had the opportunity to rebuild the interior as the first arts and crafts manifesto house in the United States, finally able to create interior architecture to complement his furniture. Stickley had an interest in the integration of architecture with furnishings to create an entire craftsman movement. Truly, he was the William Morris of the United States, and this house was his Red House, inspiring American arts and crafts architects for decades afterwards, including Frank Lloyd Wright. This new house in Syracuse was Gustav's first attempt at architecture. He put in what he envisioned a craftsman interior should look like. It was the first craftsman interior in the country and was the basis for all the architectural plans and renderings that were later featured in the magazine. It becomes a sort of backdrop for Stickley where he can act out his arts and crafts persona, and it soon had many imitators. People could now see how Stickley pieces could be lived with and how they could furnish their entire home with textiles, furniture, carpets, and other architectural details that all coordinated to create the craftsman lifestyle. The arts and crafts movement in America held great appeal for the young budding architect Frank Lloyd Wright, who used the craftsman aesthetic in his early houses and his bulky wooden furniture. Although he later turned his back on the arts and crafts movement, the Wright House and Studio in Oak Park, Chicago, contained typical craftsman furniture such as bow windows, steep gables, a recessed fireplace, built-in cupboards and benches, and stained glass windows. Wright's dissatisfaction with American architecture at the time might as well have stood as a manifesto statement for the American arts and crafts movement as a whole. He says, "We as Americans believe in our greatness when we have passed up a pantheon to the god of money in a night or two, like the Chicago National Bank. And it is our glory to get together a mammoth aggregation of Roman monuments and temples for a post office. Every commercial interest in any American town, in fact, is scurrying for respectability by seeing some advertising connection with the classic. A commercial renaissance is here, the renaissance of the ass and the lion skin. This much, at least, we owe to the late Columbian Fair." Gothic seems to be accepted as appropriate for scholastic purposes, yet why should an American university in a land of democratic ideals in a machine age be characterized by second-hand adaptations of Gothic forms, themselves adapted by a feudalistic age with tools to use and contradictions to face totally different from anything we call our own? 9 out of 10 American interiors are planned by a board while an art architect is hired to put the architecture on it. So architects like Gustav Stickley and Frank Lloyd Wright are championing the idea that America deserves its own indigenous architecture, separate from Europe and uninspired from the past. Now we have 4 whole lessons on the life and works of Frank Lloyd Wright, but just to give you a little bit of a sneak peek, here's probably the most famous house of his early career, the Roby House, which he designed in a kind of adaptation of the Craftsman style, which he called the Prairie style. Frank Lloyd Wright essentially invented the open plan of the American house, and this is kind of his breakthrough work, but we're going to talk about this all in a couple lessons. Before the next test, we're going to do architect biographies on Frank Lloyd Wright and Charles René Mackintosh, because the arts and crafts movement is really the first stirrings of what we would recognize as modern architecture. Many of the best craftsman-inspired architects in the US moved to California at the turn of the century. Among them was Irving Gill, who shared some of the same background as Wright. He moved to San Diego, where he picked up on the local Spanish missions, meaning church or monasteries, in its recent revival style, as well as old adobe buildings. He liked the bare honesty and frankness of these buildings and wanted to reduce it of its historical frills to become a sort of indigenous Californian craftsman style. He developed an abstract language of flat-roofed buildings with planar facades and long steel sash windows, sometimes painted in muted colors, which went far beyond the British and even American freestyle's attempt to shed historic associations. His masterpiece, the Dodge House in West Hollywood, built in 1915, presented an arranged sequence of pure volumes, punctuated by broad, asymmetrically placed windows. While his exteriors remained severe, he loaded the interiors with the craftsman's love of built-in wood furniture and inglenook fireplaces. He also incorporated many technological innovations, including a kitchen sink garbage disposal, an automatic car wash in the garage plan, flush doors that swing on hidden hinges or slid into walls, a central vacuum cleaning system, sheet metal doors, natural and unadorned wooden surfaces indoors, and skylights and windows that provided for luminous, sunlit interiors. It is without exterior ornament save that furnished by vines. Fergil believed beauty should be organic and that no amount of ornament can redeem a badly designed structure. He wrote that we should build our houses simple, plain, and substantial as a boulder, then leave the ornamentation of it to nature, who will trim it with lichens, chisel it with storms, and make it gracious and friendly with vines and flower shadows, as she does the stone in the meadow. There is not even an overhanging roof to break the severity of the exterior. Gill thinks that there should be nothing more arrestingly beautiful than a plain wall across which move shadow clouds or a silhouette of a flower, and that no carving or frescoing could more perfectly finish a doorway or window than a vine or creeper. He pioneered the use of tilt-up concrete walls in projects such as the La Jolla Women's Club of 1912 and perfected the Los Angeles bungalow court type as an alternative to single block multiple housing. He built the Horatio West Court of 1919 with reinforced concrete walls. It was an early example of attached beach houses which shared pedestrian and vehicle access. The 6 little buildings are grouped on a 60-foot lot. The steeped massing resembles the pueblos of the Southwest, while the many arches, patios, and doorways resembled the arches of the Spanish missions. Subtle shifts in the layout of the units allowed for optimal exposure to views of the ocean. Stickley's Craftsman magazine promoted the modest bungalow type, a small house framed by shade-giving verandas, as the ideal American home. He frequently published examples built by the Green brothers, Charles Sumner and Henry Mather. Like Wright, they were fascinated by Japanese brackets, bundled beams, and joinery without nails, and the open plan. A sequence of spaces that can be modulated by sliding panels remains one of their principal strategies of house organization. Among the 30 houses designed by them in Southern California before World War I, the Gamble House of 1907 was their masterpiece. Built for one of the heirs of the Procter & Gamble soap company, it seems more a villa than a bungalow. Raised on a rough brick base, the porches were shaded by spreading roofs, supported by Japanese-inspired rafters that protruded beyond the eaves. The architects had to train the workers themselves because of the artisan handiwork inspired by Japanese temple carpentry that went into building the house. They left no hard edges in the entire house, sanding and polishing the corners of every wooden joist. The Green brothers avoided using metal nails, preferring highly burnished mortise and tendon joints and down pegs, much like Stickley's furniture. Indeed, Sumner and Mather were very Japanese-inspired. The stained glass panels in the front door recalled the tree-focused scenes painted on folding screens found in Shoin palaces in Japan, but the medium of leaded stained glass recalled the simple medievalism so characteristic of the arts and crafts movements. Soon, the Hillside Club emerged in the University of Berkeley, California, this group with very similar objectives to Howard's Garden City Society. They were nature lovers, slept outdoors, took long hikes, and followed exotic diets of nuts and berries. They were essentially the American version of the Garden City Society. One of their members, a BU Arts trained architect, Bernard Maybeck, arrived in Berkeley in 1890 and designed bungalows for his fellow Hillside Club colleagues. He was a very eccentric medievalist who frequently threw medieval-themed parties and dressed up for them. He wrote that a house should be a landscape garden around a few rooms for use in case of rain. Maybeck became the first professor of architecture at the University of California and designed several of its buildings. His very eclectic desire to integrate folk wisdom with historic sources, a very arts and crafts idea, was best expressed in the First Church of Christ Scientist built in 1909. Here he incorporated Japanese-style trellises, Gothic tracery, and modern steel-sash windows with reinforced concrete construction. The plan was square at its base but became a Greek cross at the clerestories. The massive free span of the interior was achieved by intersected wood-frame trusses that sprang from the 4 concrete piers. Painted Gothic tracery filled the structural gaps. The church, like his craftsman houses, weaves the indoors with the outdoors using deep eaves, pergolas laced with vines, and generous porches. Maybach had encouraged one of his best students, Julia Morgan, to go to the Beaux Arts School in Paris. She came back and became the first woman to finish the program and went on to a prolific career, designing over 700 buildings. She initially worked with Maybach on several campus buildings, but later on her own built St. John's Episcopal Church in 1910. With open truss, redwood rafters, and shingle siding, it remained her lasting tribute to the craftsman style. Morgan went on to design several women's institutions, including several YWCAs. She designed the Ashmolean Conference Center in 1914, a conference center for the YWCA in Pacific Grove, California. It was a complex of 16 buildings, 11 of which are still standing today, complete with tourist campgrounds. Its buildings were and still are frequently rented out and used for large social events. Here in the conference center, she repeated the exposed redwood structure of her church, integrating it with a stone base and monumental fireplace made of cyclopean boulders. She organized the entire campground around long wooden tent buildings set on an elevated boardwalk, consistent with the craftsman's love of outdoor living. William Rudolph Hearst, developer of the largest newspaper chain in America, quickly became Julia Morgan's greatest client due to her excellence at building historical fantasies in the craftsman style, developed through her apprenticeship and collaboration with Maybach. The two collaborated on Wyntoun early in her career, a multi-structure private rural estate in California owned by Phoebe Hearst, William Hearst's mother. It was full of storybook castles and houses set in the misty redwood forests, complete with a hunting lodge, a castle, and an arts and crafts style Bavarian village.